My name is Rachel Adams, and I was 30 years old the night my sister-in-law smiled at me across a plate of pot roast and said the farm was hers now. Not ours. Hers. I want you to picture the table first, because I still see it when I close my eyes. Candlelight catching the water glasses. The smell of rosemary and browned butter drifting in from the kitchen. A gravy boat shaped like a rooster that Diane Whitfield had owned longer than I'd been alive, its beak chipped from some Thanksgiving decades before I existed. 11 place settings, and one of them, mine, always just slightly closer to the kitchen door, like I might need to get up and fetch something at any moment. That's where they'd sat me for 6 years. Nobody ever said it was on purpose. It was on purpose. Jessica set her wine glass down first. She always did things first. First to speak, first to laugh at her own jokes, first to remind everyone at that table that she was the real Whitfield in the room, and I was just something Daniel had brought home one Thanksgiving and somehow never returned. "The farm is in our name now," she said. She wasn't looking at Daniel when she said it. She was looking at me. I picked up my glass. I took a sip of wine. I didn't answer her right away because I already knew something she didn't. Something I'd been carrying quietly for 3 years, folded into a plain manila folder in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, underneath old tax returns and seed catalogs, where nobody would ever think to look for the truth. What Jessica didn't know, sitting there with her smirk and her new deed and her $400 highlights, was that the paper she was holding wasn't worth the ink on it. And she was about to find that out in front of every single person she'd ever tried to make small. But to tell you how we got to that table, I have to take you back. Back before the farm. Before Jessica's smirk. Before any of us knew what her mother had quietly agreed to help her do. If you're new here, welcome to Betrayal House. We tell true stories of ordinary people who get pushed to the edge by the families who were supposed to protect them, and who fight back not with shouting, but with something quieter and a great deal more dangerous. Patience. If that sounds like your kind of story, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now, because I read every single one. Now let's go back to the beginning. I grew up in a 2-bedroom rental outside Dayton, Ohio. The kind of house where the furnace worked when it felt like it, and the neighbor's dog barked at nothing until midnight. My mother did the books for a hardware store downtown. I used to sit on the floor of her office after school, sorting receipts into piles by color, and I loved it. Something about numbers lining up. Something about a ledger that balanced when everything else in a given month didn't. It made the rest of the world feel less chaotic. My mother used to say I had an accountant's heart in a little girl's chest. And she wasn't wrong. We didn't have much. What we had, we kept careful track of. I think that's where it started, honestly. Long before I ever heard the name Whitfield. My mother raised me alone after my father left when I was 6. And I watched her build a whole life out of exact change and careful planning, never once complaining where I could hear it. She used to tell me, folding coupons into a worn accordion envelope at the kitchen table, "Nobody can take what they can't find, Rachel, and nobody can argue with a number that's written down." I didn't understand yet how much that sentence would end up shaping my entire life. I just knew it made me feel steadier somehow, in a house that otherwise felt like it could tip over at any moment. If you grew up watching a parent stretch too little into just enough, you already know exactly the kind of woman I became. Careful, watchful, never loud about what I was owed, but never willing to let it simply disappear either. I met Daniel at a county fair when I was 22, standing in line for a corn dog he ended up paying for without asking. He smelled like hay and diesel, and had a laugh that made strangers 2 booths over turn their heads. He talked about his family's farm the way other men talk about a first love, and I found that unbearably charming at the time. I didn't know yet that in that family, land wasn't just land. It was a scoreboard. The first time Diane Whitfield looked at me, she looked at my shoes. Flats, scuffed at the toe, the only nice pair I owned. "City girl," she said to Daniel, not to me, like I wasn't standing 3 feet away holding a casserole dish. Well, she'll learn, or she won't. I learned. I learned how to get up at 5 to help with the calving, my breath fogging in the barn air, my hands raw from the cold. I learned which fields flooded first after a hard rain, and which combined belt always needed replacing sometime around the second week of October, like clockwork. I learned to keep my mouth shut at dinner when Jessica talked about her real contribution to the family, which, as far as I could tell, consisted of showing up twice a year in a car worth more than the farm's tractor and posing for photos near the fence line. We got married on the back lawn under a rented tent that leaked through one seam the entire reception. Jessica gave a toast that mentioned Daniel's true family 3 separate times, raising her glass each time like she was awarding herself a medal. I smiled through it. I was good at smiling through things. Nobody put my name on anything for the first 2 years. Not the mailbox. Not the family portrait that hung in the front hallway, updated every Christmas. Always somehow taken on a day I was running an errand that nobody had actually asked me to run. I told myself it didn't matter. It mattered. I remember the first Christmas most clearly. Diane had the photographer set up in the front parlor at 10 in the morning, a Saturday, and I'd been asked, the night before, almost as an afterthought, if I could run into town for more cream since we're short. By the time I got back, 45 minutes later, cream in hand, the sitting was over. I stood in the doorway in my coat, watching everyone still arranged on the good sofa, laughing at something, and Jessica caught my eye over her mother's shoulder and smiled the exact smile she'd wear years later across a plate of pot roast. Nobody apologized. Nobody even mentioned it. Diane just took the cream from my hands and said, "Perfect timing. We needed that for the coffee." I hung my coat up slowly that day, in the hall closet at the farmhouse, and told myself it was a small thing. Small things add up, though. I want you to remember that, because it's true in every family, not just mine. There was a baby shower 2 years later, for a cousin on Diane's side I barely knew, and I helped set up for 6 hours, folding napkins, hanging streamers, hauling folding chairs out of the barn loft in the July heat. When the guests arrived, Jessica introduced me to a table of women I'd never met as Daniel's wife. She helps out around here, the way you'd introduce hired help you were fond of. Not family. Help. I smiled and shook their hands anyway. I always smiled. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it's part of why nobody at that table ever saw what was coming. A woman who smiles through 6 years of small cruelties does not look, to people like Jessica, like a woman capable of taking anything back. That was their first mistake. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from living inside a family and still being treated like company. You learn to read a room the way you'd read a spreadsheet with a hidden error in it. Something's off. You just can't always say exactly where. The moment that started to change things wasn't dramatic. There was no fight, no slammed door. It was a Tuesday in March, cold enough that the water trough had a skin of ice on it. And Walter Whitfield, my father-in-law, was sitting at the kitchen table with a shoebox of receipts and a look on his face like a man drowning in 6 inches of water. The accountant quit, he told me, not quite meeting my eyes. Said the books haven't matched in 2 years and he's tired of guessing. I asked if I could look. He hesitated. I think some part of him still saw me as the girl in the scuffed flats. But he was tired, and desperate men hand things to whoever's willing to carry them. 3 nights later I had it sorted, spread across our kitchen table under a single hanging lamp, coffee gone cold beside me. Every invoice matched to every payment. A double-billed fertilizer order caught and refunded. An insurance policy that had lapsed without anyone noticing, which I got reinstated a full 6 weeks before a hailstorm tore through the county and could have wiped out the entire equipment barn. Walter looked at the spreadsheet I'd built, then looked at me for a long moment. The kind of look you give someone when you're revising an opinion you've held for years. "You saved this place," he said quietly. "I won't forget that." I didn't know yet how literally he meant it. That was the beginning of something between us, Walter and me. A kind of trust that had nothing to do with blood. He started bringing me into conversations Diane didn't sit in on. Property tax questions. A dispute with a neighbor over a fence line that had drifted 18 inches onto our side sometime in the 80s, and nobody had ever fixed. He'd call me before he called his own lawyer, half the time, just to ask what I thought, and I'd hear the pride in his voice when he introduced me to other farmers at the co-op as my daughter-in-law. She keeps the books tighter than the bank does. The fence dispute, in particular, taught me something about this family I never forgot. The neighbor, a man named Pete Sorensen, had been mowing an extra 18 inches of Whitfield land for 30 years and genuinely believed it was his. Walter had been too polite or too tired to ever push back. I pulled the original survey from the county archive myself, drove out to Pete's place with the map spread across my lap, and sat with him at his own kitchen table until he understood, calmly, without anyone raising their voice, exactly where the line had always been. He moved his fence 3 weeks later. Walter told that story at the co-op for years afterward, always ending it the same way. She didn't yell. She just brought the paperwork. There was a bank problem too, the same year, one Walter hadn't told anyone about because he was ashamed of it. A loan officer had flagged an old equipment loan as delinquent, and the farm was 6 weeks from a formal default notice by the time I found the letter, unopened, in a stack of mail on the counter. I called the bank myself, laid out a repayment plan on paper the way I'd laid out ledgers as a little girl on my mother's office floor, and got it approved before Walter ever had to sit across from a banker and explain himself. He never brought it up again. He didn't have to. I saw the way he looked at me differently after that, like a man recalculating a debt of his own. Here's something the Whitfields never quite understood about me. I don't need to be loud to notice everything. Jessica noticed the shift too. She didn't like it. "Must be nice," she said to me once, at a 4th of July barbecue, watching Walter and me go over a lease agreement at the picnic table, while everyone else played cornhole in the yard. Playing farmer's wife. Some of us actually grew up here. You just signed a piece of paper. I didn't grow up here. I built here. There's a difference, and eventually, everyone at that table was going to learn it. For a few years, life had a rhythm to it that felt almost like peace. Daniel and I lived in the old farmhouse, the one with the crooked porch step Walter kept meaning to fix. We expanded the herd from 40 head to nearly 90. We repaired the barn roof ourselves over one brutal August, and I still remember the smell of fresh cedar shingles and sunscreen, the sting of splinters in my palms, and how proud I felt standing under it afterward, soaked in sweat, watching a storm roll off harmlessly to the east instead of straight through a hole that wasn't there anymore. There was a night that spring I still think about more than almost any other. One of our best heifers went into a breech labor at 2 a.m, the wind howling sideways against the barn doors, and the vet was 40 minutes out on a bad road. Daniel held the flashlight. I had my arm in up to the shoulder, guided by nothing but instinct and a diagram I'd studied in a library book the year before, half convinced I was about to lose them both. I turned that calf myself in the dark, breathing in rhythm with an animal in more pain than I'd ever witnessed, and when the calf finally came, slick and coughing and alive, I sat back in the straw and cried harder than I had at my own wedding. Walter found us there 20 minutes later, having driven out in his pajamas the second Daniel called him. He looked at the calf, then at me, covered in straw and blood and afterbirth, my hands shaking with adrenaline. "That's a Whitfield calf if I ever saw one," he said quietly. "Strongest thing on this whole farm right now is sitting in the hay." He didn't mean the calf. Walter gave me his grandmother's ledger book that year, a battered leather thing with a cracked spine, entries going back to 1951 in careful, fading pencil. "Family keeps this," he said, setting it in my hands like it weighed more than it did. Figured it ought to be with somebody who actually reads it. I kept that ledger on the shelf above our kitchen table from that day forward. I want you to remember it, because it comes back later. Then Walter had his stroke. It was a Sunday morning in October, frost still silvering the grass. Diane found him on the kitchen floor, and by the time the ambulance got him to the hospital in town, the left side of his face had gone slack in a way that never fully came back. He recovered enough to talk, to walk with a cane, to sit at that same kitchen table where I'd once untangled his shoebox of receipts. But something in him had shifted. Some days he called me by his late sister's name. Some days he forgot he'd already eaten breakfast and asked for it twice, patiently, like a man asking a reasonable question. I remember sitting in that hospital hallway the first week, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, a vending machine 2 doors down that only took exact change, and Daniel's hand gripping mine so hard my fingers went numb. Walter's doctor, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Ibarra, pulled us aside and used a phrase I'd never heard before: vascular cognitive decline. He explained it the way I try to explain hard things to you now, in plain words, no dressing it up. Every so often, the blood flow to certain parts of Walter's brain would come up short, and when it did, his sense of time would blur, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for a whole afternoon. It wasn't constant. That was the cruelest part. He could be sharp as ever at breakfast and lost by dinner, and there was no way to know in advance which version of him you'd get that day. Watch for stretches after a hospital stay or a medication change, Dr. Ibarra told us. Those are when it tends to be worst. I wrote that down too. I didn't know yet how much that single sentence would matter. Diane changed too, and not for the better. She grew cold toward me in a way I couldn't name at first. She started deferring to Jessica on things she never used to defer on. Where to schedule Walter's follow-up appointments. Whether to sell off the north pasture to a developer who kept calling. Small decisions at first, the kind that don't look like anything until you stack them up later and see the shape they were building toward. Jessica started visiting every other weekend instead of twice a year. She'd sit with Walter for hours, patient in a way I'd never once seen from her, and I told myself, for longer than I'm proud of, that maybe she'd simply grown up. Maybe fear of losing her father had finally made her kind. I want to ask you something, because I think a lot of you already know this feeling. Have you ever watched someone circle a person they claim to love, and understood, before anyone said a word out loud, exactly what they were circling for? I knew. I just didn't know yet what shape it would take, or that it was already too late to stop what had been quietly set in motion weeks earlier, on a hospital visit I hadn't even been told about until it was over. It happened in April. Diane called to say Walter was having a rough patch and had been kept overnight for observation after a bad reaction to a new blood pressure medication. By the time I got to the hospital the next morning, he'd already been discharged. Diane met me in the driveway, her arms crossed against the cold. "He's fine," she said. "Just needs rest. No need to make a fuss." I should have made a fuss. I didn't yet know there was a fuss to make. Which brings us back to that Sunday dinner. The rooster gravy boat. The candlelight. 6 weeks after that hospital stay, nobody had told me the full truth about. Jessica set down a folded piece of paper next to her wine glass, like she was placing a winning hand of cards. "Mom and I had the trust updated," she said, smiling at Diane for approval, the way she always did before delivering something cruel. "The farm's in our name now, Mark's and mine. It's official." Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "What are you talking about?" he said. Not a question. A demand dressed up as one. "Dad's been declining for a while," Jessica said, and her voice took on that syrupy, reasonable tone people use right before they say something monstrous. "Someone responsible needed to step in. It's not personal, Rachel. It's not personal, Rachel." I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, because it is one of the cruelest sentences a person can say to someone whose entire life they've just tried to quietly dismantle. "You've never once changed a diaper on this farm, Jessica," Daniel said, his voice rising for the first time that night. "You've never fixed a fence. You show up twice a year and act like you own the place." "I don't act like it," Jessica said, sliding the paper across the table toward him. "I have the paperwork." That's when I took my sip of wine. I set the glass down slowly, the way you set down something fragile when you don't want anyone in the room to hear your hand shake, even though mine wasn't shaking at all. 3 years of quiet work had made sure of that. "Can I see it?" I said. Jessica's smile widened, the smile of someone who has already decided you've lost. I read the document. A quitclaim deed, transferring the farm into a family trust, with Jessica and her husband Mark named as trustees and sole beneficiaries. Signed 6 weeks ago. Notarized by a woman I'd never heard of. In an office 2 counties over. The exact week Walter had been hospitalized for that rough patch nobody had wanted to discuss with me. A quitclaim deed, in plain terms, is just a piece of paper where one person signs away whatever ownership claim they have in a property. No guarantees attached, no questions asked by the county about whether the signer actually understood what they were giving up. Which is exactly why it can be challenged, if you can prove the person signing it didn't have a clear enough mind to understand what he was doing. Lawyers call that lacking capacity. I looked up at Diane. "Did you take him to sign this the same week he was in the hospital for confusion?" I asked. Nobody answered. That silence told me everything I needed. "I think we should talk to a lawyer before anyone signs anything else," I said, calm as still water. Inside, my heart was going like a hammer against a fence post. But I had learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room usually loses it, and the calmest person is usually the one who's already won. Jessica laughed, a short, ugly sound. "There's nothing to talk about. It's done. You can start packing up the farmhouse whenever you'd like." I didn't scream. I finished my wine. "Okay," I said. "I'll call Mr. Coleman on Monday. I want you to remember that name, because Coleman's office was about to become the most important room in this entire story. But before I tell you what happened when I walked through his door, let me say this. If you've ever been the person in a family who does all the work and gets none of the credit, the one they only remember exists when they need something signed or fixed or cleaned up, I want you to know I see you. Hit that subscribe button now, because where this story goes next, you are not going to want to miss it." Monday morning, I sat across from Harold Coleman, the same lawyer Walter had used for 30 years, in an office that smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco he'd quit years ago, but never stopped smelling like. There was a brass clock on his desk that ticked louder than I expected, and I remember counting the seconds between his sentences without meaning to. "Rachel," he said, folding his hands, "I was wondering when someone would call me about this." That sentence stopped me cold. "You knew," I said. "I drafted a document for Walter 3 years ago," he said. "He asked me not to discuss it with anyone until it mattered. I assumed, given recent events, that it might be mattering very soon." He pulled a thin file from his cabinet, the paper inside slightly yellowed at the edges. Inside was a deed, recorded at the county recorder's office 3 years earlier. The same spring I'd untangled the farm's books and caught the lapsed insurance policy. It added Daniel and me as joint owners with right of survivorship, meaning that if anything happened to Walter, our names would already be legally attached to the property. No probate court, no waiting, no argument. Walter had never told us. I called Daniel from the parking lot before I'd even started the car, and he was so quiet on the other end of the line I thought the call had dropped. "He never said a word," Daniel finally said. 3 years, and he never said one word. "Would it have changed anything, knowing?" I asked. "No," he said slowly. "I don't think it would have. I think that might have been the point." We sat with that for a moment, both of us on opposite ends of a phone line, absorbing the strange, quiet gift Walter had given us without ever asking for a single thank you. "He said he wanted you to earn the confidence in your own time," Coleman said. "Not because a piece of paper told everyone to trust you." I sat there holding a copy of a deed that had been quietly protecting my future for 3 years, while I'd had no idea it existed. I thought about that ledger book on my kitchen shelf, all those decades of careful pencil entries, and how Walter had handed it to me the same year, almost like he'd been leaving me a trail of breadcrumbs the whole time without saying so out loud. I wanted to see the original with my own eyes, not just a photocopy in a lawyer's file. That afternoon, I drove to the county recorder's office, a squat brick building downtown with a metal detector nobody ever turned on, and a clerk named Diane, of all things, though a kinder one, who pulled the record up on a computer that looked older than my marriage. "Recorded March 14th, she said, turning the screen toward me. "Right here, public record. Anybody can pull this." I asked her to print me 3 certified copies. She didn't ask why, and I didn't offer. Some kindnesses come in the form of a clerk who minds her own business and gets the job done. Sitting in the parking lot with those copies in my lap, county seal stamped fresh and blue on each page, I felt something settle in my chest for the first time in weeks. Not triumph, just solid ground. It's an odd sensation, holding proof of something you didn't know you already had. There's something else, Coleman said. If you're prepared to fight this properly, not just defend it. I told him I was. He explained a legal idea called undue influence, which basically means that if someone pressures a vulnerable person into signing something that benefits the pressurer, courts can throw the document out entirely, as if it never existed. You'll need proof, he said. Medical records showing his state of mind at the time. Witnesses willing to say what they saw. A timeline no one can argue with. I already knew where to start. I'd been the one keeping Walter's paperwork straight for years. Old habits die hard, and thank God for that. That week, I drove to the hospital records office and requested Walter's discharge paperwork from 6 weeks earlier. The clerk behind the glass barely looked up as she printed it. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward and read it twice, my hands cold against the steering wheel, the heater blasting uselessly at my feet. Patient exhibited intermittent confusion regarding time and place. Recommend follow-up cognitive assessment before resuming independent decision-making regarding financial or legal matters. There it was, in the hospital's own words, signed by his doctor, dated 4 days before Jessica's notary stamped her deed. I called the notary's office listed on the document. A tired-sounding receptionist told me the notary who'd signed it had left the company 2 weeks ago and wasn't allowed to discuss client files, company policy, nothing personal. I sat with that dead end for 2 days before I remembered something. Diane's friend Carol worked at that same notary's office. Carol, who'd been at Christmas dinner every year for a decade, who always brought the same green bean casserole, who'd once told me, half joking, half not, that Diane had asked her for a favor back in the spring. I called her on a Thursday evening, my stomach in knots. I really shouldn't say anything, Carol said, her voice tight, the sound of a television murmuring behind her. I'm not asking you to lie, I told her. I'm asking you to remember what actually happened. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought she'd hung up. Diane brought him in, Carol finally said. He kept asking where his truck was. It was parked right outside. Jessica told me not to worry about it, that he does that sometimes now. I wrote every word down the second I hung up the phone, my hand shaking now, finally, alone in my own kitchen where no one could see it. There was one more piece, and it came from somewhere I never expected. Diane's phone had been backing up to a shared family cloud account for years, a setting Walter had put in place back when he still handled that sort of thing, mostly so photos of the grandkids wouldn't get lost. I wasn't looking for anything when I opened it one evening to pull an old picture of Walter for a doctor's form. I found a string of text messages instead, still synced from months earlier, between Diane and Jessica. Jessica, just get him to the notary Thursday before he has another bad week. We don't want another delay. Diane, he seems tired today. Are we sure this is the right time? Jessica, it's fine. He signs things. He doesn't have to fully understand every detail. That's what the trust language is for. I read that last line 4 times. He doesn't have to fully understand every detail. That was Jessica, in her own words, admitting she knew exactly what she was asking her father to do. I printed those messages that same night and drove them to Coleman's office first thing the next morning. This, Coleman said, reading it twice himself, is the kind of thing that wins a case before it ever sees a courtroom. Here's the thing about being the person who's always underestimated. Nobody watches what you write down. Have you ever had to build a case, quietly, piece by piece, against people who assumed you'd never fight back? Tell me in the comments, because I think more of you have lived some version of this than you'd expect. And if this story is landing for you, now is the moment to hit that subscribe button, because it's about to get a lot more personal. Jessica moved fast once she realized we weren't rolling over. Within 2 weeks, a for sale sign appeared at the end of the driveway. Not officially listed yet, just a photographer's car in the yard one afternoon while Daniel and I were in town picking up feed, snapping pictures of our barn, our fields, the crooked porch step Walter had never gotten around to fixing. You can't sell what isn't clearly yours yet, I told her over the phone, my voice level, my stomach in knots. It's ours, Jessica snapped. The trust says so. You should really talk to a lawyer, Rachel, before you say things you can't back up. I already had. The realtor called 2 days later, a pleasant enough woman named Diane Colson. who had no idea she'd stepped into a minefield. "I just wanted to confirm access for a walkthrough Thursday," she said. Jessica mentioned the current occupants would be, quote, transitioning out soon. "The current occupants," I told her, "own this property, legally, as of 3 years ago. I'd strongly suggest you get that in writing from your seller before you schedule anything else." There was a long pause on the line. "I'll be making some calls," Ms. Coulson said, and she did. The listing never went any further than that single unofficial walkthrough that never happened. I don't know exactly what she said to Jessica afterward, but the for sale sign came down from the end of our driveway 3 days later, and nobody ever mentioned it again. Then she went further. She told Diane that Daniel and I were planning to have Walter declared incompetent just to steal the farm. A lie so vicious it took my breath away when Diane repeated it back to me over the phone, her voice shaking with a fear Jessica had planted in her like a weed in good soil. "I would never," I told Diane. "You know I would never do that to him." "I don't know what to believe anymore," Diane said, and hung up before I could answer. At Walter's next doctor's appointment, Jessica showed up uninvited and tried to get him to sign a form, authorizing the sale of the equipment barn separately, before any of the deed questions could be settled in court. I found out because the office called me directly. My name was still listed as his secondary emergency contact, something Jessica, in her rush, had never thought to change. "He seemed confused about what he was signing," the nurse told me carefully, "and legally we can't proceed if there's any question about that." Bless that nurse. I still think about her. 2 days after that, I came home from the feed store to find a locksmith's van in the driveway. A young guy, maybe 25, stood on our porch with a drill in his hand, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I was told to rekey this door," he said. "Somebody named Jessica set it up. This is my house," I said. Not loud, just flat. "I live here. My husband and I have lived here for 6 years. He checked his work order, then checked the address, then looked at me like he already regretted his whole morning. "I'm going to call my dispatcher," he said. And I stood on my own porch and watched him do it, arms crossed, saying nothing else, because I didn't need to. He left 10 minutes later without touching a single lock. I called Coleman that same afternoon, my voice shaking for the first time in weeks. "She's not just trying to take the land anymore," I told him. "She's trying to lock us out of it. Then we move faster than she expects," he said. That night, Daniel and I had the closest thing to a fight we'd had in 6 years of marriage. Not at each other, at the situation, which is a distinction that matters more than people think. "I should have told you about the deed the day Dad recorded it," he said, pacing our kitchen, refusing to sit down. "I didn't even know for sure he'd gone through with it. I thought he was still thinking it over." "You didn't do this," I told him. "Your sister did. She's still my sister." "I know," I said. And I did know, because that was the hardest part of the whole thing for him, harder than any deed or lock or lawsuit. I could fight Jessica with paperwork. Daniel had to fight the version of her he'd grown up loving, the one who used to let him win at checkers when they were kids, the one who existed somewhere underneath the woman who'd just tried to lock me out of my own house. He sat down eventually, put his head in his hands, and I stood behind him with my palms on his shoulders, and neither of us said anything else for a long while. Some fights aren't won with words. Some just need someone standing quietly behind you until the worst of it passes. "Whatever happens," he finally said, "I want you to know I see everything you've done for this place. I've always seen it. I just never said it enough. You're saying it now," I told him. That was enough. That same week, at a smaller family dinner, just Diane, Jessica, and Mark, Jessica said something to me I will never forget, because it told me exactly what she thought of me, and exactly why she was about to lose. "You know what your problem is, Rachel," she said, swirling wine in her glass like she was auditioning for a role in a movie about herself. "Some of us were born into this family. You just married into it. You'll never actually belong here, no matter how many spreadsheets you make." She leaned back in her chair, satisfied, certain she'd landed a final blow. "Honestly," she added, "I don't know why Dad ever trusted you with anything more than the grocery list. Some people just aren't built for legacy, Rachel. You're built for spreadsheets." I looked at her for a long moment, the kitchen clock ticking somewhere behind her, the same rooster gravy boat sitting between us on the table like a silent witness that had seen this coming from the very first Christmas. "I've spent 6 years making sure this family had a farm left to fight over," I said quietly. "You've spent 6 years showing up twice a year to remind everyone whose name is on it." She laughed it off. She wasn't laughing for long. Daniel and I made a decision that night, over cold coffee at our kitchen table, the ledger book watching us from its shelf like it had an opinion of its own. We weren't going to fight this in a courtroom first. We were going to fight it at the table where it started. Diane's birthday dinner was coming up in 3 weeks. The whole family would be there. Jessica would be there, glowing, certain, victorious, already telling people the farm was hers. We picked that night on purpose. Coleman helped us build a folder, not a metaphorical one. A real manila folder, the kind I'd hidden in my filing cabinet for 3 years without even knowing what it was for, now filled with copies of the recorded deed from 3 years earlier, the hospital discharge notes, a signed statement from Carol, and a timeline laid out in my own handwriting. The same careful handwriting I'd used to untangle Walter's shoebox of receipts the first week I ever proved myself useful to this family. We told no one what we were planning. Not Diane. Not Walter, though it broke my heart a little to keep it from him, given everything he'd already quietly done to protect us. Coleman made me rehearse it, twice, sitting across his desk like a man running a fire drill. "Say it exactly like you'll say it there," he told me. "No anger in your voice. Anger gives people something to push back against. Facts don't." The first time I tried, my voice cracked halfway through the sentence about the hospital records. Coleman just waited, patient, the brass clock ticking between us, and had me start again. By the second rehearsal, I didn't crack once. "Good," he said. "Now do it again like you're not even angry anymore, like you're just reading a weather report." That's the version I carried into that dinner. Calm as a weather report. It's a strange thing, to practice the worst conversation of your life until it stops sounding like the worst conversation of your life. 3 weeks is a long time to sit on a folder like that. Some nights I'd take it out just to look at it, to remind myself it was real, that I hadn't imagined any of it, that the paper in my hands actually meant what Coleman said it meant. Some nights Daniel would find me at the kitchen table at midnight, the folder open under the lamp, and he'd just sit down across from me and hold my hand and not say anything at all, because there was nothing left to say. We both knew what was coming. Diane called me 2 nights before the birthday dinner, her voice small in a way I'd never heard it. "I keep thinking about that appointment," she said, not naming which one. "He kept asking about his truck. I told myself he was just tired." I didn't say anything for a moment. Some part of me wanted to comfort her. A bigger part knew I couldn't, not yet. Not until the truth was fully on the table where everyone could see it plainly. "We'll talk Saturday," I said. "All of us." "Rachel," she said, before I could hang up, "whatever happens Saturday, I need you to know I didn't understand what she was doing. Not all of it. I believed her. I still believe her. But belief and forgiveness don't always arrive on the same schedule, and I wasn't ready to hand her the second one yet. The night of Diane's birthday dinner, I wore the same blue dress I'd worn to our wedding rehearsal, the one Jessica had once called a bit plain for the occasion. I brought the folder in my bag, tucked beside a card for Diane that I meant every word of, because whatever her daughter had done, Diane was still the woman who'd once, on a good day, told me my pot roast was almost as good as Walter's mother's, which from Diane Whitfield was practically a proposal of marriage. We sat down. Same table, same rooster gravy boat, its chipped beak catching the candlelight the way it always did. Jessica across from me, smug in a way that told me she thought the war was already over. Walter was having a good day. Present. Sharp-eyed. I was glad, because he deserved to hear this clearly. Not through a fog he'd have to be reminded of later. Partway through dinner, Jessica raised her glass for a toast to her mother, and somewhere in it, she couldn't resist working in a jab. "And to new beginnings," she said, glancing at me, "now that some things around here have finally landed where they belong." I set down my fork. I agree, I said. Let's talk about where things belong. I reached into my bag. The folder hit the table with a quiet, solid sound. The kind of sound that somehow silences an entire room faster than a shout ever could. 3 years ago, I said, Walter had a deed recorded at the county office adding Daniel and me as joint owners of this farm. It was legal. It was recorded first. And under the law, that means it takes priority over anything signed later. Jessica's smile faltered. That's not... Mom, is that true? I didn't wait for Diane to answer. 6 weeks before your deed was signed, I continued, sliding the discharge papers across the table. Walter was hospitalized and diagnosed with intermittent confusion about time and place. His own doctor recommended no legal decisions be made until a full evaluation was done. I slid Carol's statement across next. And the notary who witnessed your signing remembers him asking where his truck was, while it was parked outside. I set one more page on the table, the last one, the one I'd almost hoped I wouldn't need. And these are your own words, Jessica, texted to your mother back in April. He doesn't have to fully understand every detail. That's what the trust language is for. Jessica went very pale. Somewhere down the table, one of the younger cousins actually gasped out loud, and their mother shushed them gently, though nobody looked away. The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your ears like water. You knew he wasn't well, I said, looking directly at Jessica, my voice never rising above the same calm register it had been in since the appetizers. You knew, and you drove him to sign anyway, because you were terrified that if you waited, the truth would come out on its own. The truth that this family already trusted someone else with this land. Someone you never respected enough to imagine could outplan you. This is insane, Jessica said, her voice cracking at the edges. Mark, say something. Mark, to his credit, said nothing at all. He was staring at the discharge papers, like they might rearrange themselves into a version of the evening he could survive. Daniel's Uncle Frank, seated at the far end of the table, set down his own fork with a quiet clink. Jessica, he said, did you drive your father to sign paperwork 4 days after his doctor said he shouldn't be signing anything? Jessica didn't answer him either. She didn't answer anyone. She just stared at the folder like it might disappear if she looked at it hard enough. You tried to have the locks changed on our house, Daniel said, his voice steady now, no longer rising, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd shouted. While Rachel was out running errands for this family, the way she has been for 6 years. Walter reached across the table, slowly, and put his hand over mine. I told you, he said, his voice a little thick, that I wouldn't forget. Diane was crying by then, quiet tears she didn't bother wiping away, looking at her daughter with an expression I can only describe as a mother watching her own reflection crack down the middle. I didn't know he was that confused, Diane whispered. Jessica said it was fine. She said he was fine. I said what needed to be said, Jessica snapped, but there was no smugness left in it. Just a woman realizing, in real time, in front of everyone she'd ever tried to impress, that the ground she'd been standing on had never actually been hers. I want to ask you something, because I think this is the part of the story a lot of people wait the whole video for. Have you ever had a moment where the person who underestimated you finally understood, all at once, exactly how badly they'd misjudged you? That moment, right there at that table, was mine. And it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like relief. The farm is in our name now, I said quietly, echoing her own words back to her, watching them land like stones dropped into still water. It has been for 3 years. You just didn't know where to look. Nobody said anything for a long time after that. In the weeks that followed, Coleman filed to have Jessica's deed voided on the grounds of lack of capacity and undue influence. The hearing itself lasted less than a single afternoon. I sat in a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled faintly of floor polish, Daniel's hand in mine under the table, and listened to a judge read through the hospital records, Carol's signed statement, and those 4 lines of text message, one after another, in a flat, unhurried voice that made every word land like a verdict all its own. The court finds clear and convincing evidence, she said, that the March deed was executed under conditions raising substantial doubt as to the grantor's capacity, and further finds evidence of undue influence by the beneficiaries named therein. Jessica's attorney didn't even ask for a continuance. With Carol's statement and the hospital's own records lined up end to end, it wasn't much of a fight. The court set the quitclaim deed aside within 2 months, restoring full clarity to the deed Walter had recorded 3 years earlier. Let me tell you what happened to each of them, because I think you've earned the full ending, not just the highlight. Mark moved out of state for a work opportunity that showed up suspiciously fast. I don't think he could sit across from Jessica after watching her lose that clearly, in a room full of people who would never forget it. Last I heard, they'd separated quietly the following spring. Jessica didn't come to Thanksgiving that year, or the year after. She sent one email to Coleman's office, through her own attorney, asking whether the family intended to press criminal charges for elder fraud. We didn't. Walter asked us not to, and we honored that, though I won't pretend it was an easy thing to let go of. Diane still sends her a card every Christmas. I know because I'm the one who addresses the envelope. Carol got a fruit basket from us every December after that, and an open invitation to Sunday dinner she never quite took us up on, though she always called to say thank you. Coleman retired 2 years later and handed his practice to his nephew, but he still stops by the farm every spring, unannounced, just to see how the fields are doing. Walter used to joke that Coleman loved this land almost as much as the family did. Pete Sorensen heard the whole story eventually, the way everyone in a small town hears everything eventually, and he brought a 6-pack over the following weekend, set it on our porch step without much ceremony, and said only, "Figured you could use a beer more than a fence discussion this time." It's still the nicest thing anyone outside the family ever did for us during the whole ordeal. Diane changed the most, in the end. Grief has a way of clarifying people. She started coming by the farmhouse on Sunday afternoons. Quiet visits, no agenda, just to sit on the porch and watch the fields turn gold in the late light. One afternoon, watching me go over the lease renewals at the kitchen table, the same table where all of this had started, she said something I never expected to hear from her. "You were always the one actually taking care of this place," she said, not looking at me, watching the fields instead. I just didn't want to admit that the person doing it wasn't blood. I told her it was all right. I meant it mostly. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a single decision you make once at a dinner table. It's something you keep choosing, in smaller doses, on ordinary Tuesdays, long after the dramatic part of the story is over. Some weeks I managed it easily. Some weeks, watching Diane fuss over the same rooster gravy boat at a holiday table Jessica no longer sat at, I felt something harder settle in my chest instead, and I let myself feel that too. I don't think you owe anyone a clean, finished forgiveness on any particular timeline. I think you're allowed to still be working on it years later, the way I still am, some days. Walter passed away 18 months later, peacefully, in the farmhouse, in the room that overlooked the north pasture he loved most. Before he went, he asked me to bring down the ledger book from its shelf one last time, and he traced his finger over his grandmother's handwriting from 1951, then over mine, added quietly beneath it in the years since. "Family keeps this," he said again, the same words from years before. Good thing it landed with somebody who actually reads it. I sat with him until nearly dawn that final night. The ledger closed on the nightstand between us, and I won't pretend the grief that followed was simple or tidy. Some mornings, in that first year, I'd catch myself reaching for the phone to call him about a lease question before I remembered. Grief does that. It doesn't care that you've already had your goodbye. It just shows up anyway, in the small, ordinary moments, and asks you to survive it one more time. Daniel and I own the farm outright now. No trust, no ambiguity, no smirking relative waving a fresh piece of paper across a dinner table. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still take out that old manila folder. It's mostly empty now. The important pages long since filed with the courts, framed or handed back to Coleman for his records. But I keep it in the drawer anyway, right below the shelf where the ledger sits. A reminder. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. The people who count you out because you're quiet, because you weren't born into something, Because you show up early and work hard and never raise your voice, are almost always underestimating exactly the wrong person. Quiet isn't weak. Quiet is just biding its time. I think about that girl on her mother's office floor sometimes, sorting receipts into piles by color. And I don't think she ever imagined that skill would one day save a farm, a marriage, and a family, all in the same folder. But that's the thing about the quiet skills nobody claps for. You never know which one is going to matter most, until the night it does. I'm not going to tell you every family fight ends this cleanly. It doesn't. Some documents are never recorded in time. Some proof never surfaces. I got lucky in ways I try not to take for granted, and I know that. But I'll tell you what I do believe, without any hesitation at all. The people who underestimate you are almost never as thorough as they think they are. They assume quiet means unprepared. They assume kindness means you won't fight back. Every single time, in my experience, that assumption is the crack in their whole plan. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, someone who smiled at you like they'd already won, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of your stories are the reason I keep making these videos. If you made it this far, thank you for sitting with me through this one. If it moved you, hit subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear that patience isn't the same as surrender, and I'll see you in the next story.